How many zones you got? 3. You? 5. Ha! I got 6. 6. What? How many have you got? 7. Training zones, they are not new, but my oh my do they cause some confusion. So, what are they? Why do you use them? How do you find yours? And how many zones do you even have in the first place? Let's start with what training zones are. So basically, if you can imagine the range of effort that you can put into cycling, from your absolute maximum effort right down to the least amount possible while still being sat on your bike and not on your sofa. Then split that range of effort up into levels or zones. The lower the zone, the easier the exercise intensity, and the higher the zone, the harder you have to try. The reason for doing it is so that you can get more out of your training, effectively get fitter by training in a more precise and scientific way. So you, your coach or your training plan can effectively schedule each training session to have a specific training goal. And you achieve that by spending a certain amount of time in certain zones, but they're not wasting any time or energy in zones that aren't going to lead you to that precise point. So then over weeks and months of doing these precise sessions, you end up reaching your ultimate goal, be that riding 50 miles or winning the Tour de France. Now it sounds serious, and winning the Tour de France certainly is, but it doesn't have to be. You see, what zone training does is it allows cyclists to train in a way that would be really easy in other sports. Imagine going to the gym and lifting weights. Zone training is basically telling you what weights to lift, how heavy, and how many reps to do. The alternative is simply to walk in, pick up random weights, throw them around a bit, and then walk out again. Instead of lifting known weights though for a certain number of reps, in order to quantify how hard you're trying on a bike, we use time. And then, in terms of gauging your effort, you can use either a heart rate monitor, a power meter, ideally a combination of both, along with how it's actually feeling. But if you have no tech at all at your disposal, then don't worry, because I think I can teach you how to find the most important training zones based only on feel. And I'll do that a little bit later. So that's a very basic assessment of why you should do it. But we're going to go one step further. The reason why the zones are set at the specific intensities they're at is because they try and correspond to when your body is in a specific metabolic state, i.e. what energy system are you using. So to help to explain that, we're going to go back to the OG of zone training. In the beginning, there were 3 zones: endurance, threshold, and above threshold. Those zones correspond to the lactate levels in your blood, which are a great way of showing exactly how hard your body is working. On a graph of easy to maximum effort plotted against lactate concentration, you can see that there are 2 inflection points, 2 points at which the line changes from low and stable to lactate levels starting to increase, and then from a steady increase to through the roof. And you guessed it, the 3-zone model corresponds to those 3 distinct sections on the graph. The first zone is called the endurance zone, and this is where you can see that lactate levels are steady and they're not really increasing, up to the point where it changes, which is known as LT1. Above this, you're in the threshold zone, where your lactate levels are steadily increasing as your effort increases, but all at a sustainable level, so where you're able to utilize the lactate as fast as you're producing it. The next point though, LT2, shows the transition to where you're on borrowed time. So this is where your anaerobic system begins to kick in. You might be able to sustain 20 minutes, it might be that hard, you can only do 10 seconds. The 3-zone model is scientifically pretty robust. Those 2 inflection points come as your body is changing metabolic systems. So in the first zone, you're principally burning fat as a fuel. In the second zone, you're principally burning carbohydrate. And in the third zone, you begin to move to work anaerobically as well. Now those are really important points. As we've heard from Dr. Inigo San Millan in the past, knowing where you're about to shift gears into the next metabolic system allows you to train in the most efficient way, effectively getting the most out of every session. However, most of us will not have lactate testing on tap, so it's important to note that as well as lactate changing, your breathing rate also changes at these 2 points on the graph. And your heart rate as well typically tracks quite nicely along with lactate, and that the harder you go, the higher your lactate and the higher your heart rate. Although, as we'll see, basing training purely on heart rate alone is not necessarily the most accurate way of doing things. The 3-zone model is perhaps a little bit oversimplistic for what we need it for. The first zone is too broad. It encompasses everything from both twiddling along like this right up to some pretty serious endurance training that feels quite hard after an hour or two. But then the middle zone is exactly the same. The bottom end feels completely different to the top end, which neatly segues into your anaerobic zone that again encompasses everything from 20-minute max efforts right through to 10-second max sprints. So unless you know that you're talking about the very top of the endurance zone and the very top of your threshold zone, it's impossible to be prescriptive enough with this model, which is why most zone training models have more zones than just 3. 5 is common, in part because that's what Apple Watches do. So zones 1 and zone 2 come up to that first inflection point, LT1, remember. Then zones 3 and 4 sit between LT1 and LT2. And then anything above that is just called zone 5. And it's not bad, you know, for endurance training, those are the zones you need, particularly 2 and 4. And if you're training on heart rate alone, again, it kind of works. However, in cycling, and particularly when training for competitive cycling, we need to be more specific in that upper training zone. So you then find that most cycling training talks about 6 or even 7 zone models, which sound more complicated on the face of it, but actually it's just splitting up that top zone into 3. So zone 5 is your VO2 max zone. So that's from about 10 minutes down to 5-minute intervals. Then zone 6 is anaerobic capacity, so that's 30 seconds to 3 minutes. And then zone 7 is full-blown max sprints. So hopefully you can see why it's particularly good for competitive cycling, because those durations, that's where your races are won and lost. Zone training is great. It's what all top cycling coaches use. However, it has its limitations, mainly based on the data that you give it. So if you do a fitness test and have heart rate data and power data and lactate data, you can be pretty sure that your zones will correspond to those metabolic levels, and you'll therefore be getting the biggest bang for your buck, training with precision and accuracy. However, contrast that with the 5 zones on your Apple Watch. So as far as I can gather, it calculates your maximum heart rate by taking your age away from 220. So for me, that would put my maximum heart rate at 180. What's that? 180. Anyway, rest assured, my actual max heart rate is a fair few beats above that. And even when you do know what your max heart rate is, it's important to note that it's a much less accurate gauge for those training zones. So for example, if you're doing shorter efforts, then your heart rate probably won't have got into the correct zone before your effort is finished. And then there's the fact that it varies hugely. So yesterday I rode into GCN Megabase in zone 2 and my heart rate was at about 153. Then 9 hours later when I rode home again at the same power, my heart rate was 139. And if that wasn't bad enough, a simple zone model based on heart rate actually won't tell you where your metabolic zones lie, because it's based on your fitness levels and your training history, probably even your genetics as well. And so what you experience might not correspond to the average, which is what the training zone model has to work off. Here's the thing though, whether that actually matters or not depends on your current fitness level. So if you've not been doing much training, either because you're new to it or perhaps you've had a period of time off and you're just getting back into it, then using an Apple Watch based on heart rate data is going to be absolutely fine, because frankly, doing any sort of riding is going to get you fitter. However, the bigger your training history, the more important it is to be accurate. So this is where a power meter comes in, because it allows you to stick to those metabolic zones with far greater precision. And then it also gives you a target to pursue. And not only that, it can quantify how fit you are, so you can see how much you're progressing. And then, well, if you're going to try and win the Tour de France, these days, you got to lactate test the shit out of yourself. One of the biggest causes of confusion about zone training seems to be that lots of the different training apps are subtly different in what zones they put you in. So for example, the zones on Strava might not quite tally up with those on Zwift or on Wahoo or on Garmin or Trainer Road or whatever. And that is confusing, but ultimately, I don't actually think it matters that much, because firstly, the boundaries between zones are not hard lines. They're blurred, of course. You don't suddenly tip over from zone 3 into zone 4. And then secondly, as previously discussed, the zones are only as accurate as the data you give it. And so unless you're there in the lab getting lactate data, you're never quite gonna know. However, you can refine the training zones on whatever app you're using, and that's by cross-referencing on feel. Breathing rate is absolutely key. Firstly, it's great because it's completely free, but secondly, I genuinely think that your breathing rate can help you find the most important zones, those points on the graph from right back at the beginning, LT1 and LT2. To stay in that zone just below LT1, so the now famous zone 2, you should be able to breathe through your nose and talk in complete sentences. But that's a tricky one, because you're talking in complete sentences, but you still sound a little bit like you're out of breath at the same time. So a little bit like I'm doing now. I find that this is the zone that doesn't correspond well to preset training zones. So like a Wahoo or a Garmin or something like that. And I think that's because of my training history. So watch out for that one. Then the next one, so just below LT2, zone 4, your breathing is fast and it's deep, but it's not uncontrolled or ragged. You can probably get a sentence out, but then you're going to need to have quite a few good deep breaths afterwards. And then for anything above that, well, those are the intervals that are done on time. And so I think that's what you work out. For a zone 5 interval of 10 minutes, you kind of know how to pace that, and so on and so forth. When riding to feel, just make sure you don't listen to your legs. I've found they tend to be quite pessimistic. My legs have only ever screamed at me to slow down and not go faster. So instead, you want to tune out all of that noise and instead focus on your breathing. Sounds very zen. Perhaps it is. Where a heart rate monitor then comes in, where it becomes really useful, is effectively after you've calibrated it against your breathing rate, because then it's a really good visual indicator for when you're going too hard or not trying hard enough, and you can let your concentration drift off a little bit. Plus, you can record it for later so that you can analyze your training over time, and then as importantly as that, it can also tell you when you're tired. Now, I personally think that the classic 7-zone model is the best one for training for cycling. So hats off to Dr. Andrew Coggan for creating that one back in the day. For the best though, do try and get hold of a power meter. Like, I'm always loath to say, buy this tech, you need it. But in this instance, they are really good. And actually, there are some relatively inexpensive options on the market. I also had a look on eBay, and there are plenty of second-hand options out there as well. So if you can stretch to it and you take your training seriously, it's definitely worth the investment. To get your 7 zones, you're going to need to start with some kind of FTP test. Now this will tell you where the top of zone 4 is, and then in theory you can extrapolate all your other zones from this point. and it will get you close, but as we've touched on in previous videos, your zone 2 isn't necessarily that linked to your FTP. There are other factors that affect it, but as mentioned a moment ago, you can fine-tune that with your breathing rate. And then, as for those upper zones, if you're a really explosive turbo kind of rider, you'll probably find that those models will underestimate what you're capable of in your upper zones. But that's fine. If you're training without a power meter, then actually you can just go on duration of intervals. A 3-minute max effort is a 3-minute max effort. You don't need a power meter to tell you. And then if you do have a power meter, then actually you can simply look at your power curve that something like Strava will tell you, and then that will give you an indication of exactly what you're capable of on those shorter durations. Quite a lot to take in this video, I'll admit, but hopefully by getting a bit of an understanding of the theory of zone training and explaining the apparent discrepancies between all the different models, then you'll see that actually all of these differences don't really matter that much. Most of us, all of us, would benefit from training in this way. But the only people that need to worry about the precise limits of which zone is where are those that are already turning the screw really tightly on their training already. The rest of us will without doubt benefit irrespective of that. Please get involved in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think. Are there any more questions arising from this video? Are there any more training topics you would like us to cover in future GCN videos? Get involved. We'll be really interested to read them. And lastly, do make sure you give this video a big thumbs up as well before you leave. It'd be much appreciated.